Hey, well, if you guys have a Bible, open up to John chapter 18. So we'll be in John 18. We'll jump over to John 21. We're going to look at a really famous story in the Bible of a guy named Peter. And if you've been around the church world at all, Peter is kind of the notorious knucklehead. He's always getting himself in trouble, just putting his foot in his mouth and doing things that he wishes that he could take back. And so the real idea that I want to talk about is something that is, I think, part of our human experience, but something that we don't talk about a lot, and it's failure. And I think the truth is, the reality of living on this side of heaven, we're going to experience failure in this life. And I would say that the determining factor on whether or not we succeed and fulfill the calling that God has placed on our life will be how you and I respond to failure. So before I read John 18, I'll tell you a quick story and give you a little bit of context of who I am, okay? So, does anybody play golf in here? Any golfers? We've got a few. All right, it's Phoenix. Everybody plays golf out here, right? It's like the golf mecca. So, I'm a pretty big golfer, okay? I love golf. I played golf my whole life, and I'm pretty convinced golf is a tough sport, okay? Not just anybody can walk out and play golf and be decent at it. Well, when I was in high school, most of my friends played soccer, and they thought golf was the worst sport ever. And I was like, dude, you play a sport that ends in a tie like 90% of the time, okay? Any sport that ends in a tie isn't a real sport. Like, and I just am not a huge soccer fan because you can watch the highlight reel in 36 seconds. It's a 90-minute game, and you get one goal. And I'm like, that... Just give me the 10-second highlight clips. And long story short, me and my buddies in high school were having this argument about what sport is harder, golf or soccer. And I'm making a real passionate argument about how golf, there's no way soccer is harder than golf. I'm like, golf requires skill. Soccer is basically running, and then every now and then you kick a ball. Like, anybody can do that. And somehow in this conversation, I make this really dumb statement. I said, I haven't played soccer since I was like 10 years old, but I guarantee if I walked out into the soccer field right now, I could make our high school soccer team. And they were like, dude, we're like number 2 in the state. Do you think you could just go out and make the soccer team? And I was like, absolutely, no questions asked, I could do it. And the moment I said it, I kind of regretted saying it because I didn't actually think that I was able to do it, but there's no way I was going to tell my friends that I wasn't going to actually try. So my senior year of high school, I haven't played soccer since I was 10 years old. I find myself trying out for one of the best soccer teams in all of California. And just a little insight into soccer tryouts. The very first day of soccer tryouts was the worst day of my life because they started with a 2-mile run. Okay, the coach was like, we're going to start with a 2-mile run. And I was like, what? And then what are we going to do afterwards? Just die? Because you don't do anything after running 2 miles. And he's like, no, then we're going to practice soccer. And so, you know, I gear myself up and I go and I'm on this run. And the bummer part is all of my friends, they're like the really good returning players who don't have to try out for the team. And so as I'm circling the track, making these laps, running this 2 miles, I look up and our school parking lot was right above the track and field. And I can see my buddies pulling up lawn chairs and setting up like carne asada fries and cheeseburgers, watching me run 2 miles. And they're like, hey, go get them, Tiger. Like, let us know how it is. And I'm like, man, I hate you guys. This is the worst. And, you know, I run the 2 miles. I almost die. I go and I do tryouts. Long story short, I don't even get through the first round of cuts. Like, I was not even close to being good, and I considered myself pretty athletic, and it was a real humbling moment for me. And so the moment the coach told me that I didn't make the team, the thought went through my head of like, man, there's no way I'm facing my friends because I just spent the last 2 hours telling them how easy this is and how I could do this in my sleep, and now I don't even make it through the first round of cuts. And so my initial thought was like, hey, we're seniors in high school, we're going off to college anyways, there's no need to continue this friendship for a year, we had a good run, I'll just get new friends. Like, I am not going to go and face the music with my buddies. And the only reason that I say that is a really silly way to kind of illustrate something that I think is a really powerful part of our human experience. That I think failure and the subsequent feeling that we feel called shame is one of the most powerful things we will experience on this side of heaven. And I would say that the number one thing that leads us to places we never thought we would go, the number one thing that takes from us more than we ever thought we would give it, the number one thing that keeps us in a place that we don't want to be longer than we ever thought we would be there, is this really powerful emotion called shame. And I think if you and I knew not just how we are called to be able to respond, but how God, how Jesus himself responds to us in our moments of greatest failure, my only hope and prayer is that we would realize that, yes, though failure might be part of our experience, the good news of the gospel is that you and I don't have to be the faithful ones because Jesus was faithful. And even in the midst of our failure, Jesus is faithful. Amen? So John 18, are you there? All right, we got 2 of you. Cool. The rest of you can catch up with us, okay? So John 18, real quick context, okay? John 17 is this really famous part of Scripture where Jesus is getting ready to go to the cross. He pulls his disciples into the upper room. The famous picture where they're all sitting around the table, which is totally historically inaccurate. There's no way they would all be sitting like that, but that doesn't matter, right? That's the scene that takes place in John 17. Jesus pulls his disciples in. He knows the final hour is coming where he's going to go to the cross. He's going to die. He's going to be crucified. And he starts to teach his disciples some of the most incredible things that we see in the entire gospel accounts. Well, then John 17 ends. He prays for all of the disciples. They go out to the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus starts to be in anguish. The Bible says he's in so much anguish that his heart is going to break. And he's praying, God, if this can pass, let it pass. But if not, let your will be done, not mine. And then Jesus is going to be betrayed by one of his closest friends named Judas. And this is what happens following in John 18, verse 15. They arrest Jesus. They take him off. And this is what happens. It says in verse 15, it says, Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of the disciples. Okay, the other disciple is John. And it says the other disciple was acquainted with the high priest. So he was allowed to enter the high priest's court with Jesus. Peter had to stay outside the gate. Then the disciple who knew the high priest, John, spoke to the woman watching at the gate, and she let Peter in. The woman asked Peter, you're not one of this man's disciples, are you? No, he said, I am not. And because it was cold, the household servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. Hey, if you were highlighting, underlining, circle charcoal fire. It will make sense in a second. They stood around it warming themselves, and Peter stood with them warming himself. Okay, so here's what happens. Jesus has predicted this moment to his disciples long before. He tried to tell them that this was going to happen, and then he even told them what to do when it did happen. And the number one thing that Jesus told them not to do was to follow him to Caiaphas' house. Okay, Jesus gets arrested. They take him to the high priest's house, this guy named Caiaphas. They arrest him, take him to this house, and immediately Peter and John begin to follow. And I know it seems really subtle. It seems really insignificant, but they take the first step towards failure, which is simple disobedience. Okay? One of the things that will ultimately lead us to places of failure is when we choose to step outside of what God has asked us to do. And sometimes it's really simple, really insignificant things, but Jesus and John follow when they were told to go somewhere else. And if you read this account in the Gospel of Matthew, it gives us a massive insight into what happens when we step into these moments of disobedience. And it says that Peter and John began to follow Jesus at a distance. And here's what I need you to hear this morning, that I think that there's a process that leads us to failure. I don't think failure is something that we just wake up and decide to do today. I don't think anybody wakes up and says, today's the day that I'm going to throw my life away. Today's the day that I'm going to cheat on my wife. Or today's the day that I'm going to do the thing that I never thought that I would do. I think that there's a process that ultimately leads us to failure. And the first one is a really simple step that is usually outlined by disobedience. But I think the motive that's often behind it is this thing called doubt. And if we could go and sit with Peter and John in this moment, I guarantee you one of the guiding forces in their heart was doubt. Because they've given their lives to this guy named Jesus, and he was supposed to usher in a new kingdom. He was supposed to overthrow the Roman government. He was supposed to overthrow these people that have been tyrants in their lives for the last 100+ years. And now he's arrested. Now he's being taken away in handcuffs. And I think that they probably had that moment. They said, man, what have we given our life to? Were we wrong? I know he was a good guy and he had some powerful things that he said, but maybe, just maybe, we were wrong. And the problem is if you and I begin to have doubt in our heart and we don't deal with it, it will lead you to do the same thing that Peter and John did. And you will slowly begin to just follow Jesus from a distance. It's a really insignificant thing. It's a really easy thing to do. You begin to follow from a distance, but the problem is if you follow Jesus from a distance for a while, eventually it will lead you to a place of just complete and utter failure. Because Peter goes, John gets to go inside the house, Peter sits outside, and he's hanging out with the same people that just arrested Jesus. And it's cold out, so they start a charcoal fire. And Peter is warming himself around this fire, and then somebody looks at Peter and they say, hey, weren't you one of that guy's disciples? Didn't you were that guy that was in the garden and you cut that dude's ear off, right? Like, you were like, who stabbed somebody in the ear? Like, that was you. I know you cut that guy's ear off. And he's like, it wasn't me. I don't know him. And remember, 24 hours before, if you go read in John 17, Jesus had predicted that Peter would deny him 3 times. He said, before tonight is over, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter, just moments before that, was saying, there's no way I would die for you. I would give up my life for you. And the only reason that I think this matters is if Peter was capable of failure. The guy that Jesus said he was going to build his church on, if that guy, the guy that wrote books in the New Testament, if he was capable of failure, I think if we're just honest, we have an honest assessment of our humanity, we all just have to realize that we are capable of failure ourselves as well. And the problem is what we do when we fail will determine whether or not we finish this race that we've been called to run, called faith. And let's keep reading and see what happens. Skip down to verse 25. It says, meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire warming himself, they asked him again, you're not one of his disciples, are you? And Peter denied it, saying, no, I am not. But one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, didn't I see you there in the olive grove with Jesus? Again, Peter denied it, and immediately a rooster crowed. Jesus predicted that Peter would deny him 3 times. We just saw Peter deny Jesus 3 times. And the moment that it happens, a rooster crows. And again, if you read this gospel account in Matthew, the same story in the Gospel of Matthew, it'll tell you that the moment the rooster crowed, Peter looked in the house and he made eye contact with Jesus. And Peter hung his head and he walked away crying. And he disappeared. We don't see him on the scene again. And the crazy part is when Peter failed, he immediately ran and thought that God was done with him. Because the reason that we know this is the rest of the Gospels don't really tell us where Peter is. But if you keep reading, there's a story where Mary, the 2 Marys, after Jesus goes to the cross, after he's put into the tomb, 3 days later, Mary Magdalene and Jesus' mom, Mary, they go to the tomb. They go to the tomb to do a bunch of burial things. And they get to the tomb, but the stone has been rolled away. And inside the tomb is an angel. And the angel tells them, Jesus isn't here. And he's got something important for the disciples. So make sure you go get the disciples. And then he says something that gives us indication of where Peter was. He says, go get the disciples and make sure you get Peter as well. Which tells us, it shows us, all it shows us is what failure, what shame, what condemnation will do to us. Failure will make you believe your best days are behind you. Shame will make you believe that God can't use you anymore. Peter, because he failed, believes that he was no longer qualified to be one of Jesus' inner circle guys. But this angel says, make sure you go get the disciples and get Peter too. So now flip over to John 21. We'll see what Jesus does and how he responds to them. John 21, verse 1. This is where Jesus is going to confront Peter, address Peter's mistakes. And this is what he says. It says, later Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened. Several of the disciples were there. Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and the 2 other disciples. Simon Peter said, I'm going fishing. Okay? If you don't know the story, the history of Simon Peter, Simon was a fisherman by trade. That's what he did for a living. He was a fisherman. And there's this really famous scene where Jesus goes and he finds him when he's a fisherman. And he says, hey man, you're my guy. Like, you're no longer going to be a fisherman of fish. I'm going to make you a fisherman of men. And you're going to follow me. You're going to change the world through me. I'm going to empower you to change this world. And I think it's important for us to see what Peter does the moment that he makes a mistake and the moment that he fails. Because I believe it's the same thing that you and I will do as well. I think oftentimes how, especially in, I think our culture, in our context, I think part of why failure is such a long part of our stories is because we believe the narrative is that when we fail, we go down this life of just absolute, total devastation and destruction. That does happen. And I think sometimes that is God's grace that will get us to hit rock bottom so that we can realize that we need to do something else. But oftentimes, I think the majority of us do exactly what Peter does when we fail. I think most of us just go back and do what we used to do. We just go and we get really busy building a business. We get really busy working. We get really busy with our hands. And I think most of Americans pinball back and forth between distraction and busyness. And we just stay busy or we stay distracted. We stay busy and we stay distracted. And I know it's true about Peter, and it shows me that it's true about us as well. Peter, the moment that he fails, goes right back to doing what he used to do. Part of what you have to understand is the moment you give your life to Jesus, the moment you hand over the reins to Jesus of your life, the Bible says that your life is no longer yours. In Galatians, it says that our life has been crucified with Christ, and we no longer have control to do what we want to do, because we now live a life that is empowered by the Spirit of God, which means we don't get to choose where and what we do. God does, and God chooses, but you will have a temptation when you make mistakes to just go, maybe God's done with me. Maybe I should just go back and do what I used to do. And Peter is fishing. And here's what you have to see. The next verses we're going to read. You're going to see that Peter didn't just go fishing by himself, which tells us something powerful about failure. The lie that we believe is that failure only affects us. That our mistakes, yes, there are mistakes, but it's just affecting my life. Your mistakes, your failures, my failures, they always affect more than just my life. They impact the people around us. They impact our family. They impact our wives and our children and our relatives. And our failures have long-reaching grasps. And I think part of what we have to understand is that, man, we are called to be an example, to live this life. And Peter, this guy that was supposed to be the model for the other disciples, is the one taking the disciples out with him. And here's what it says. Simon Peter said in verse 3, I'm going fishing. And all of the disciples said, we'll come too. So they went out to the boat, but they caught nothing all night. Here's the next verse, verse 4. It says, at dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. And he called out, hey fellas, have you caught any fish? In the King James Version, if you have that, it says, children, do you have any fish? It's a pretty funny story that we're getting to see. And they say no. And then he said, throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat, you'll get some. So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Okay, so get this picture. Professional fishermen are fishing all night. Okay, this is what they do. This is their living. This is what their degrees is. Okay, they are like the fishermen dudes. They're the guys you go to. You ask them questions about fishing. They're fishing all night, catch nothing. Some random guy on the shore yells at them, "Hey kids, do you have any fish?" Like, who's this guy? Like, what? Like, what do you do for a living, bro? He's like, I'm a carpenter. It's like, well, you stick to woodworking, we'll handle the fishing, okay? But for whatever reason, they look at him and they go, hey, just try it again. Just go out and, try and catch some fish. And he's like, what? But for whatever reason, the disciples choose to listen to this random guy that's yelling at him. And this is what it says. And in verse 6, it said, they threw out their net on the right-hand side of the boat, and then you'll get some. So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, for he had stripped to work. He jumped into the water and headed to the shore. Okay, so Jesus tells them, try the right side of the boat. They try the right side of the boat, and they catch all the fish that they could ever want. And I know that it's a story that sounds kind of familiar. This is the exact same scene. This is the exact same way that Jesus called Peter initially. The day that Jesus chose Peter, Peter was out fishing. He'd been frustrated, fished all day, didn't catch anything. And Jesus said, let's try again. Let's go back out. Let's do the same thing. He says, try the other side. Catches all of this fish. So the thing that we have to realize is what Jesus is doing in John 21 is he's recreating the scene where Peter was initially called to be a disciple. What I think Jesus is doing is he's actually reminding Peter that I chose you in spite of you. All of those years ago, I chose you knowing that you were going to fail, knowing that you were going to make mistakes. I didn't choose you because you were perfect. I didn't choose you because you were going to do everything correctly. I chose you because of who I can be in you. And he starts to recreate the scene, and the moment the fish start to fall into the net, Peter realizes this isn't just some random guy yelling at us. This is Jesus. And he does a very Peter thing. He actually puts his jacket on, and then he jumps into the water. It's like, Peter, you take your jacket off, and then you jump into the water. Like, you don't put a heavy coat on before you go swimming. But again, it's Peter, okay? Like, he's kind of crazy. And Peter puts his coat on, jumps into the water, and he just starts swimming, trying to get to Jesus. And here's what it says in verse 8. It says that the other disciples stayed with the boat and pulled the loaded net to the shore, for they were only about 100 yards from the shore. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire. Okay, highlight, underline, circle, charcoal fire, and some bread. And then verse 10 says, bring some of the fish that you've caught, Jesus said. So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to the shore. There were 153 large fish, and yet the net hadn't torn. I don't know about you, sometimes I just laugh when I read the Bible, like they decided to stop and count the fish. They knew it was Jesus, but they're like, hold on, Jesus, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 153. John, make sure when you write this that you put down there was 153 fish. Like, it's so random. It has no significance. There's a lot of theologians that try to make sense of the 153 fish, and that was the number of countries that they were going to spread the gospel to. But it's just a random number. They decided to count the fish, and for whatever reason, they knew how many fish were there. But the disciples get to the shore. They get to Jesus, and notice what Jesus is doing. He's cooking fish for breakfast, which that's kind of weird, like who eats fish for breakfast? But besides that, Jesus is cooking breakfast for the disciples over a charcoal fire. And I know that it doesn't really mean much on the surface, but if you go and get some Bible software and you type in fire in the Bible, you'll see a million different examples of fires. There's all kinds of fires all over the Bible. There's fires everywhere. Everybody's lighting stuff on fire in the Bible. But if you go in and you type in charcoal fire, there's only 2 times in the entire Bible that you'll see a charcoal fire exist. The first one is in John 18 when Peter has his moment of greatest failure. The moment where Peter fails the greatest is sitting around a charcoal fire with a bunch of people that he shouldn't have been around. And he has his moment of greatest failure. And then the second time you'll see a charcoal fire is in John 21 when Jesus begins to recreate the scene for Peter to be reconciled back to God. And it gives us massive insight into the heart of God and how he responds when we fail. Because Jesus is going to great lengths here to remind Peter of who he is. He recreates the scene of his calling, and he says he's reminding him of why he chose him. But the second thing that Jesus is doing is he's also recreating the scene of his greatest failure. He's recreating the charcoal fire, and he's kind of telling Peter, Peter, I love you, and I want to use you, and I'm going to do incredible things through your life, but we have to deal with this. We have to address this moment of weakness, not because I'm mad at you, because if we don't address this, if we don't actually go there and acknowledge what happened, the enemy will forever have a foothold into your life. And every time a rooster crows, it will remind you of who you really are. It doesn't matter how much progress you make if you don't address this thing. The enemy will always have a thing to pull you back and to pull you down. And what I'm trying to do, what Jesus is trying to do to Peter, what I'm trying to convince you of this morning, is that Jesus isn't mad at you if you've made mistakes. The incredible news of the gospel is it doesn't matter what we've done. It doesn't matter how far we've fallen. That the good news of the gospel is that our best days are always in front of us. But what we have to be willing to do, yes, Jesus wants to forgive us. Yes, Jesus wants to restore us. But he also wants to not just forgive your moments of weakness and your moments of failure. He wants to reconcile and redeem them. He wants to heal your wounds, not just band-aid them over. And I think the hard part is so many people, they're afraid to look at the moments that they've had mistakes, the moments that they've fallen short. And what I'm trying to tell you is that if we're not willing to just address them, we will forever have this thing that the enemy can use. And it doesn't matter how much progress we make. The enemy will always remind us, but this is who you really are. Let's keep reading. Here's what it says in verse 10. Jesus said, bring me some of the fish that you've caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to the shore. There were 153 fish. Now come and have some breakfast, Jesus said. None of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? They knew that it was the Lord. And then Jesus served them the bread and the fish. This was the 3rd time that Jesus had appeared to his disciples since he had been raised from the dead. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied, you know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. A 3rd time that he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a 3rd time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And then Jesus said, then feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go." Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, "Follow me." Verse 20 says, Peter turned around. He saw behind them the disciples Jesus loved, the one who had leaned over to Jesus during supper and asked him, "Lord, who will betray you?" Peter asked Jesus, "What about him, Lord?" Jesus replied, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? As for you, follow me." It's one of the most powerful scenes in the Bible. Peter's greatest failure was 3 times publicly he denied ever knowing Jesus. And what Jesus does to restore Peter is 3 times publicly in front of everybody, in front of all of the other disciples, in front of all of the people that he was embarrassed to see. He asks him, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter's kind of taken back by the question. He goes, "Of course I love you." And then Jesus asks him again, "Do you love me?" He says, "Yes, I love him." And if you go look at the commands, Jesus says, "Feed my sheep, take care of my sheep." Jesus is essentially telling him, then get back up. Go back. The mission hasn't changed. Go back and step back into who you're supposed to be. Get back on mission. Do what I've asked you to do. And the 3rd time that he asks him, Peter starts to get mad. Like, "Why are you asking me this?" And Jesus says, "If I don't do this, you'll forever be stuck in this place." And John 18 and John 21 is one of the most powerful stories in all of the Bible that gives us so much insight into the heart of God, of how Jesus responds to you and I when we fail. His answer to you and I when we make mistakes and when we fall short. What Jesus wants to do is he wants to make breakfast for us. And it's like, why would he serve breakfast? Well, you don't eat breakfast with people that you don't like. You don't have breakfast with people that you don't want to be around. And what Jesus is trying to get them to see, what I'm hoping that you can see this morning, is that Jesus calls us in spite of us. Jesus is going to use us in spite of us. We have to realize that though failure might be part of our experience, failure is never meant to define us. It was never meant to be the thing that forever derails us. It can be just a temporary speed bump that keeps us on the path, or it can be the thing that derails us. And to kind of bring all of this full circle, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Johnny Cash at all, but Johnny Cash has a really incredible story. And what most people don't know about Johnny Cash is in the late 60s, when he was starting to really take off, he had written a few hit songs. He had a really, really bad drug habit. And Johnny Cash didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to do because he was starting to get a lot of the prayers that he had been praying answered. He was starting to get shows booked, but he had this drug habit that he didn't know what to do with. And so Johnny Cash, if you go read his autobiography, it's a really powerful story. He decided that what he should do is just go. He knew these caves that he used to go as a kid, and he knew that if he could just crawl to the back of these caves and just die, that nobody would ever be able to find him. And so literally Johnny Cash's plan was to take a flashlight that had about 2 hours of battery life, and he would go to these caves and he would crawl all the way to the back. And he said, "I was going to crawl until my flashlight ran out of battery." And it's exactly what he did. He crawled to the back of one of these caves, got to the back of this cave, his flashlight died, and he lay down and said, "I was ready to die," because he believed what we all believe when we fail. That we believe that we deserve the worst. We believe that we should die alone, that we should just be segregated from society. And that's what Johnny Cash believed was his fate. And he said that when he laid down, he was overwhelmed with the most incredible feeling that he had ever felt in his life, and it was the presence of God. And he said in that moment, God spoke to him. He said, "Johnny, you might be done with you, but I'm not done with you yet." He's like, "I still have incredible plans for your life." And he said it was the most powerful moment that he's ever experienced. But he said it's kind of funny when you read it, because he said, "But I don't know what to do now, because I'm 2 hours into a cave and I have no flashlight to get out of here." And it was like pretty scary. And God told him, he said, "Just start crawling. Just start crawling to get your way out." And Johnny Cash said that's what he did. He literally just started crawling, and he would reach and feel to make sure he wasn't going to fall over a cliff. And he said it took every ounce of energy that he had. He thought he was going to die just getting out of the cave. And he barely was able to make it outside of the cave. And the moment that he did, outside of the cave was 2 of his closest friends, and they said, "God told us to come here. God said that you needed help, and he told us to bring water and food." I mean, it's one of the most incredible stories. And they took Johnny Cash, they put him in rehab, and he gave his life to Jesus, and he ended up going on to do incredible things. He went on to do Billy Graham crusades, and he wrote songs like "Walk the Line" and did all of this stuff to glorify God. But he had the same temptation that you and I all do when we fail. Failure can either be a speed bump in the road or it can be the thing that derails us. But what I want you to hear this morning, my hope for everybody here, is that we would understand the gospel. The fact that Jesus died. He was our penalty for sin. He went to the cross and he forever paid the price for our failure. And because he did that, you and I have an invitation to truly live, even in spite of our failure. Amen? Let's pray.